Readers of Mark's Gospel have long noted that there's a shift in chapter 8 of Mark. Before chapter 8, Jesus is healing and casting out demons and teaching the crowds in Galilee. His audience is always the ordinary people of the land, people from the villages and countryside. He also engages in rather ominous conflicts with the leaders of the land, both political and religious. But his ministry is to the least of these, the peasant farmers of Galilee among whom he grew up. But in chapter 8, things begin to change. After Peter's confession, the gospel begins to reorient itself toward Jerusalem. Jesus and his disciples begin journeying toward their destiny in Israel's capital city. 3 times in chapter 8, chapter 9, and chapter 10, Jesus lets his disciples know what's ahead for him and for them. Scholars have called these 3 passages the Passion predictions. Jesus tells them he's going up to Jerusalem and he's going to be betrayed to his enemies. He's going to be crucified and raised on the 3rd day. To say the least, this does not go down well with the disciples. You remember that last week, Peter, when he heard the first of the Passion predictions, takes Jesus aside and says, no, this isn't going to happen. This is wrong. This is not what's going to happen to you. And for his pains, Peter gets called Satan by Jesus. In a passage we heard this morning, having perhaps learned something from the experience of Peter, when Jesus predicts his passion and death, his disciples remain sullenly silent. This was clearly not what they had in mind. It's not what they had signed up for. They were looking for glory and victory, and the Romans kicked out of Galilee and Judea. No more crucifixions, for goodness sake. But as they go on their way, they begin to converse on the road. The disciples are like kids arguing in the back seat of the car with their parents in the front seat. They get to Capernaum. Jesus says to them, guys, tell me, what were you talking about on the road? And like those kids in the back seat, they knew they were in trouble, because they'd been arguing about who was the greatest disciple. Perhaps they were dreaming about being commanders of the army of Israel when Jesus came into his power. Perhaps one of them wanted to be the chief right-hand man of Jesus, his prime minister. But when Jesus heard them and understood them, they must have been terribly embarrassed. So Jesus calls them over and he sits them down like parents calling a family meeting or the principal calling someone into the office. They knew this couldn't be good. And as Jesus consistently does, he turns things on their head. He tells them, look, if you really want to be first, the most prominent, the most important, the most noble, then you have to be last and the servant of all. This is Jesus' upside-down kingdom, a kingdom where normal values are rejected, where society's winners and losers are recalculated, where society's values are shown to be ephemeral, but God's values are shown to be eternal. Jesus caps all of this off by taking a child into his arms. And he suggests to the disciples, if they really want to be important, if they really want to be number one, the best, they need to receive children. Now surely, this was a blow to their egos. Children, we know from the ancient world, were among the least important people. They were loved, certainly, but they could, as children, contribute very little to the support of the household. They were a drain on family finances. And daughters were particularly troublesome. A daughter would become a major expense when it came time for her to marry. In frescoes depicting Roman families or reliefs on gravestones, you'll frequently see several sons, but seldom more than one daughter. Excuse me. Excess daughters were often exposed, left outside to die, or sold into slavery. No, children were not clearly at the top of society's order of importance. And that's exactly where the disciples aspired to be. Jesus' words to them must have been a bitter pill to swallow. Being a disciple was turning out to be, well, not what they expected. From its very beginning, the church has known that it's in the disciple-making business. It's about calling people to follow Jesus as the disciples followed him, to hear his teachings, to see his mighty works, and as he suggests elsewhere, to bear his cross. But the disciples and Jesus himself has taught us, if he's taught us anything, that discipleship is hard. Back in the 1990s, after the brutal war and genocide in Rwanda, someone asked one of the religious leaders, how could this happen? This is one of the most Christian countries in all of Africa. The leader replied, it seems we made plenty of adherents, but very few disciples. The challenge of our church at both its local and national level is to make disciples of Jesus. This is something our outgoing presiding bishop has emphasized throughout his decade of leadership. We need to be followers of Jesus. But which Jesus? There are plenty of Jesuses out there trying to claim our allegiance. And I would suggest that the Jesus we're looking for is not the Jesus of some fundamentalist, the Jesus who comes raging with his AK-47 blazing, taking out his, read their, foes. And those enemies, of course, would include many of us. This Jesus comes to impose his or their will where necessary with violence and brutality. No, we don't need Rambo Jesus. And we don't need the Jesus of my people, the academics, the biblical scholars and theologians. This Jesus is all too often so pale and bloodless that he fades away into oblivion like the grinning Cheshire cat. This Jesus is so vague and indistinct as to leave us nothing to follow. Neither is it gentle Jesus, meek and mild, who's so inoffensive, so ineffectual, as to cause anyone to wonder who would want to follow him in the first place. This Jesus wants us to be nice to each other. This is a man who is kind to children and tells sweet stories, but you don't get crucified for being kind to children and telling sweet stories. No, none of these Jesus or many other Jesuses are worth following. The only Jesus worth following is the one that one scholar calls the real Jesus. That Jesus is the actual historical young Jewish man, perhaps only 30 years of age, who taught and loved and lived and died, and we confess was raised from the grave in ancient Galilee and Judea. This Jesus was radiant with God's love, electric in his teaching and storytelling. This Jesus exuded compassion for the least of these, for the least of Israel and the Gentiles as well. This Jesus was courageous in his confrontation of those who distorted God's message and held his people in thrall. This last part, of course, was humanly speaking what got him crucified. It was this Jesus who proclaimed good news to the poor, release of the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, freedom for the oppressed. This Jesus proclaimed life in the face of death, hope in the face of fear, love in the face of hate, joy in the face of sorrow. He drew from the great prophets of Israel the promise of Israel's God that he would make all things new and wipe every tear from every eye. This is the mission of Jesus' disciples from then until now. This is what we are called to. We are called to join him in this mission. We are, as our emphasis for this year insists, called to serve. We are called to make God's kingdom present, to call others to follow Jesus in the way of peace and joy, and to stop worrying, as the disciples did, about who got the credit and who was the greatest. As desperate and difficult, as frightening as things are these days, that is our calling. This is, as James put it in the passage we heard this morning, wisdom from above. First, it is pure, then peaceful, gentle, obedient, filled with mercy and good deeds, fair and genuine. Those who make peace, he continues, sow the seeds of justice by their peaceful acts. The disciples then, and many Christians to this day, imagine that we can only enforce the will of God through raw acts of power, through the sword, through law, through intimidation. And this has been the path of the church in the past and is still the aspiration of many today, but it has never worked for long. And it was not, and it is not the way of Jesus. We need to stop worrying about our place in society. We need to stop worrying about the survival of the institution. If we take up the mission of Jesus, the institution will take care of itself. If we don't take up Jesus' mission, the institution is pointless. If we accept our death, we can live into our resurrection. If we're willing to be last, we can, in the end, find ourselves first. If we accept what the disciples then and most disciples since have been unable to do, we can make God's love, God's grace, and God's peace palpable, just as that young Jewish man did so many years ago. Thanks be to God.